Hey everybody, this is Dream, and today we have a 12-game slate for college basketball. I hope everybody did well yesterday. I did pretty good, so I hope we can continue that success in college basketball, especially with no NBA. This slate looks a little bit better than yesterday's slate did, too. There's more value across the price ranges, whereas yesterday was a little bit more top-heavy. Not to say this slate isn't got some top-heaviness to it, but it does have some upside guys in the middle of the pack, and then we have some pretty good value plays as well, which I felt like there's more of them today than there was yesterday. With that said, let's go ahead and get in the slate. Before I do that, can you guys smash that like and subscribe button? Really does help the channel. I will also do a breakdown of all the games after I go through the players. So with that said, let's get into the players themselves. So I have two guys that I think are core plays today. First being Jarkel Joyner for North Carolina State. He is the highest scoring in the highest scoring game on the slate, and he's on the team that's projected to win. And he's also had 250 fantasy point games the last 3 games. He's got some really good upside here. He's among one of the higher upsides for guards, and he's averaging 0.9 fantasy points per minute. He has a really good role on this team, and he's gotten really consistent as the season's been going on. So I really like his upside here. And his floor, while it is relatively low, he is getting max minutes, and he has been playing really well as of late, which definitely gives him some motivation in a fast-paced game, especially a team that he scored 31 fantasy points against earlier this year. So I think he's in a great spot. And then we're going to talk about Nick Agenda for the forward position. He's only played 2 games so far this season, which are the last 2 games. He only started the last one, and he didn't shoot the ball very well against Xavier, but he has nice upside. He's been getting lots of blocks and rebounds, and that really does help propel his fantasy output. His price is pretty reasonable at $6,400, and he looks like he's in a good place to be the starting center for the rest of the season. And he has double-double potential if he can stay out of foul trouble, which obviously he fouled out in both the last 2 games, which did limit his minutes a little bit. But they've got other injuries and stuff too, which is going to give him more opportunity to stay in the game, assuming that they can keep it going. And DePaul, while they are a team that hasn't had, they've been inconsistent throughout the season. They're in a tight game here against Butler, which looks like it's going to be a wire buzzer beater type of game. And so if that is the case, he should have plenty of minutes as long as he can stay out of foul trouble. So he looks like a great play on the slate. I'm going to go through the guards first. So we're going to start with Tyree Appleby. He looks like he's got the most upside of any player on the slate outside of maybe Oscar Tshiebwe or Chris Murray. And he has obviously pretty expensive at $9,300, but he's a lot cheaper than some of the other players that are more expensive that don't look nearly as good. As you can see, there's at least 5 or 6 players that are more expensive than him that don't really have the same upside that he has on this particular slate. He's got the most upside, and his price does make him a little bit harder to roster at the guard position, simply because there's more guys that are quality at the forward, and so you might want to save more money in the guard place. But honestly, there's good plays everywhere, so you kind of just want to pick which guy you think is going to be the best out of the top 3 or 4. He's had some really monster games lately, which definitely helps. He had a 60 fantasy point game against UNC and a 40 fantasy point game against Duke. And as long as he can continue those type of games, and he's going to be a near must play at this price point, which is actually kind of reasonable for where he is at. Then we're looking at Wendell Green. Now he's a little bit overpriced for what I like because he has a lower floor, but he has played pretty well lately, and he does have decent upside. It's not great upside for the price. I definitely like Joyner and Appleby better, being just a little bit more expensive than him. But he does seem pretty safe here when it comes to, he's not going to probably kill your lineup if you were to utilize him at his price, though it is about as high as it's been all season long. Then we're going to look at Jaden Taylor for Butler. Now, his floor is a lot lower than I'd like it to be, and he's been somewhat inconsistent throughout the season. But he's got a nice matchup here where it's going to be a tight game, and I expect him to play well in this one. I don't expect there's not a whole lot other on Butler that I really like, but he does seem like he has some decent upside here, given the fact that he's had some good games. But his ceiling isn't as high as a guy that I normally want to pay this price for. But again, he hasn't been somebody that's been hurting you if you roster him, so he is useful from that perspective. If you need a utility player in the $7,000 range, he's somebody to consider. Another guy to consider in that range is Chase Hunter. He doesn't have the same upside either as Taylor or Green, but he does. Excuse me. But he does look pretty decent today. He does have a really low floor, though, so you do have to keep that in mind. So he's a little bit more risky, but he's a good contrarian play if you want to come off Taylor and go to a player that has a better situation when it comes to matchups and stuff like that. And so I think he is viable on the slate, but he's not quite as good as some of the other guys I've mentioned. And then we're going to look at Casey Morsell for North Carolina State. Now, I really like North Carolina State today, and he's got more upside than a lot of the other guys I just mentioned that were over $7,000. I do think he's a pretty good option here, though his floor is a little bit lower than I would like it to be, but it's higher than Hunter and Taylor. But for $7,000 price players, I don't think he is a bad look, especially in a fast-paced, high-scoring game. Then we're going to look at Mark Sears for Bama, and he's been pretty good. He has really good upside for his price. He's a little bit underpriced today. His floor is very low, though, so you do have to keep that in mind, which is a little bit annoying for a guy like him because he only had 6 fantasy points against Tennessee, which is just irritating. But he's got a better matchup today in a plus game where he should be able to play well. However, there is a little bit of risk here as well because it could be a blowout. And he only played 19 minutes in the last game against Georgia when they blew them out, but he still scored enough fantasy points where it didn't matter. And he's done that a couple times, even against Florida and Georgia. So I expect him to play well in this game and probably play better than he did against Tennessee. But he is very scoring dependent, and so that's where his risk kind of comes along, is that he is a scoring dependent player more than anything else. And if he doesn't hit his shots and hit some threes, then he's going to be a guy that you don't necessarily want to roster. Then we're going to look at Michi Johnson. Now, he's very risky because he's playing against Alabama, and South Carolina is terrible, and they may get blown out in this game. But he has more upside than pretty much anybody else in his price range, simply because he is their primary scorer and aggressor, and even when they get blown out, he tends to score a pretty decent amount of points, and he gets some assists and rebounds and stuff too, which kind of helps boost his points up. Now, he is a lot cheaper too than what he was early in the season, or at least in the middle part of the season, where his price really popped up a lot. And as you can see, he has a low floor, but when he does play well, and he does have a tendency to score points and buckets, and he hits threes and stuff like that. And he's been shooting the ball pretty well for the most part for him. And so while his team is likely going to get blown out, he does have some nice upside here, especially in a home game. And so I do think he is viable on the slate. But he is very risky because of the matchup situation. But I do think he's the best player on South Carolina when it comes to scoring fantasy-wise. So he is a guy that I think is definitely worth looking at. For forwards, we're going to start with Oscar Tshiebwe. He's my favorite play on the board. His price has come down significantly from the last few games, which really helps. Obviously, he hadn't played quite as well for a few games, but he looks like he's back to form. And Florida doesn't have Castleton. Now, last game against Florida, he couldn't really score in the game because Castleton really was just overarching him. But he did have 15 rebounds. I look for him to rebound like that again. And he should be able to have the ability to score points more in this game because of the matchup. And without Castleton, his scoring ability in this game should be over 15 real points. I could see a double-double with him really easily in this game. And I don't think Kentucky will have too much issue with Florida because Oscar will be able to do whatever he wants in this game. So I think he's in a great spot, and he looks like a great matchup here. He just missed the cut, honestly, for being a core play just due to, if you have 3 guys over $9,000, it's going to be hard to roster. But with that said, we're going to look at Chris Murray next for Iowa. Now, he's a good contrarian play to Oscar. He's the same price, but he does have just as much upside, and he's been just as good lately, though he is a double-double guy like Oscar is, so that is a little bit riskier. But he has just as much upside, and almost nobody else on the slate really has that upside in this price range, outside of him and Oscar. So I think he's in a great spot. Him, Oscar, and Appleby all are guys that you have to look at and consider here. And Murray hasn't had the price that Oscar's had throughout the season, but he does have some upside here, though he has a little bit lower floor than Oscar does too, for this situation at least. Then we're going to look at Liam Robbins for Vanderbilt. Now, I haven't ever really talked about a Vanderbilt player before, but he's averaging a ridiculous 1.56 fantasy points per minute. Now, part of that is that he doesn't usually play over 30 minutes, which is a little bit of a concern here. But he is a contrarian play off of Oscar and Murray. He's a little bit more risky than some of the other guys that play more minutes. And he's only just become the everyday starter for Vanderbilt. He didn't start for most of the year up until recently, but he's played extremely well. Now, this game is, surprisingly, Vanderbilt is favored to win the game, so that gives him some more upside. But again, his minutes are the bigger concern, so his upside is a little bit more capped than Oscar's is. But he is interesting on the slate, and his points per minute are crazy. He's been scoring a mammoth amount of points. He's had 3 games in a row over 24 points, so I look for him to have another good game here. Then we're going to look at Johnny Broome. I'm not sure if I'm saying his name correctly for Auburn, but he is just priced under Robbins. He doesn't have the upside at all that Robbins has, but he does. He has been playing well as of late, and he has destroyed Mississippi for 42 fantasy points the last time out that he played them, and so he does have some upside here. He's a little bit more risky and a little bit more contrarian as a kind of a utility option if you just need that amount of money left. But he is a guy to consider today, and he's also a good 1.26 fantasy points per minute. The big concern here, I think, is honestly the minutes. He does tend to have some streakiness when it comes to minutes, especially when they blow people out. And that is a little bit of a risk today. Not a big risk, but a little bit of a risk. Then we're going to look at PJ Hall for Clemson. Now, he doesn't have the upside that I want for his price range either. So he's another contrarian play off of Braum. But he does seem like he's played well as of late, having 18 real points in the last four games. And this matchup should be decent for him as well, where he's dominated them for a double-double the last couple times he's played Syracuse. And so I look for him to have a good game here. Sorry, the last time he played Syracuse, not the last couple times. But that was last year. And so I look for him to have a good game here. His price has popped up some, though, so he doesn't have as much ideal option. And his fantasy points per minute is over 1.1, but it's not quite as good as Broome or even Robbins, who I mentioned before. It's more along the lines of Chris Murray, which is in the similar ballpark. But he's a little bit cheaper. He just doesn't have the upside that the other guys have. But he is still somebody to take a look at. And then we're going to look at, I already looked at Uganda, and so now I'm going to look at Hayden Brown for South Carolina. Now, he's at $6,800. Now, I don't really like him compared to Michi Johnson, but he does have some upside here. South Carolina is favored to get blown out, but he has been really good in 6 of the last 7 games. He's had 10 points or more, not fancy points, and had over 4 assists in the last 7 games. And I think he does have double-double potential here, just because he's going to get the minutes, regardless of what the outcome of the game is. Even in games where they've not done well and gotten blown out, he still managed to have some pretty good games, with the exception of the Florida game. But as long as he can get around 20 or so fantasy points, I don't think he would be a terrible option here. He needs about 25, really, to pay off, and he's been doing that lately, so I think he's still a guy to consider. He's definitely a contrarian play. He just projects really well, and I'm not really certain that his price, his price is low for what he can do, but it's just the matchup. I think I think South Carolina's team, their prices all got reduced, and that gives them some opportunity to potentially be decent in a tough matchup. And that will be the same for Josh Gray. He's just in the same boat. He has nice upside with the price, but he's in a tough matchup. But he does tend to get some rebounds, which is definitely helpful. He's not a scoring guy, really. So if he can get a few buckets here, then that would definitely pay up for us. He's also been starting 10 of the last 12 games. It looks like that's his role now. And he's had at least 15 fantasy points in all those 7 games. And that's pretty close to where we need him to get. Obviously, we would like it if he would get a little bit higher than that. But he's actually been okay in games where they got blown out because he played more minutes as a result. And so I think he's got some upside here. He has he does weirdly have double-double potential in this type of matchup. And so we'll have to wait and see. But he's played well against teams that are good. So he had a good game against Arkansas and Florida, even when they had guys that were pretty tough to play against. Now I'm going to get to my value plays. And I'm going to start with J.J. Starling here for Notre Dame. And at $4,500, he likely starts. In the last 4 games, he's only started twice, and he's only played over 25 minutes once. So there's some concern here that he won't get the stable 30 minutes he was getting most of the season. But he has some upside here, and he may get more minutes in this matchup, especially if it remains close and tight. I'm not sure exactly what is up with their roster situation there. He played most of the season pretty well, getting around 30 minutes a game, and then the last like 5 or 6 games, he's kind of been reduced some and hadn't started every game. So I'm not really sure what's going on there. But he is a freshman, so sometimes this is freshman things. But it looks like he's going to have to, if Notre Dame wants to make a run here, then he is going to have to be a guy that's going to have to play well for them. But his price is so reduced that he is viable on the slate. Then we're going to look at Rylan Griffin for Bama. Now he looks like a great play here. He has 5x or 6x potential in this game. He's got the most upside pretty much of all the sub $5,000 players, with the exception of maybe one. And he has been playing around 20 or so minutes a game for the most part. He's had some lower minute games, but even in blowouts, he's played pretty well. And he doesn't need a ton of points here to pay off for us either. And while he does have a low floor, he's got a really good ceiling. And so I do think he's a viable option, especially, on Bama. Now, here's the catch with Bama. They have two guys as well, Javon Quinterly and Jaden Bradley, who both get kind of the same amount of minutes as Griffin does. And usually one or two of those three go off. I think Griffin is the safest bet, but I think the other two guys are worth taking a look at. But they're kind of inconsistent, all three of them. But Griffin is the safest. But I wanted to mention both of them because they also have tendency to have really good games. And for value plays, for a team that's likely to blow out their opponent, those guys are all probably going to get a little bit more minutes. And so they're all going to have some upside as a result of that situation. Then we're going to look at Jacoby Wright for South Carolina. Now, his price is just a little bit too cheap here for what he can do. He's got the most upside of any of the cheap options available. And though he has been starting the last couple games, but you want to make sure he does start because he's been inconsistent when it comes to starts and minutes and stuff throughout the season. But as long as he continues to start, he's going to be viable as a value play. He's also played decently, even in limited minutes against tougher opponents, and he tends to get more minutes against those teams. And so with him starting potentially, he will likely have a good upside here. But you do want to make sure he ends up starting here, and so do keep that in mind. Then we're going to look at Devin McLaughlin for Boston College. His price is a little bit higher than I would like it to be, but he's been starting the last 6 games, and he's become somewhat viable to his minutes increasing over 20 minutes. And he's been over 12 fantasy points in the last 4, and he could become a stable contributor as the season winds down. He's a little bit more risky than the other guys I mentioned, but he has some upside in this situation. And then Jalen Thomas finally, last but not least for Butler. He's a little bit more expensive, so I didn't at $5,400. I didn't want to utilize him in the forward position because I felt like he was kind of in a weird spot. He looks interesting due to the injuries on the team, and he should start and play 30 minutes. But you do want to make sure that Manny Bates is out prior to utilizing him, and that he is starting. Because if Bates is playing, then it's gonna hurt his potential here. But he's kind of a value play when it comes for Butler, and he's played really well as a starter in the 4 games he's played this year, where he's played over 30 minutes. But again, it's just you do have to make sure that he is going to start, and so you'll have to check that closer to match whenever coaches let us know. So that's what I have for this slate. I know it seems a little bit crazy, but this slate is pretty good. A lot better, I think, than yesterday's slate. I like a lot of the matchups. So now I'm going to go through all the teams real quick and give you my breakdown of each game. So the first game we're going to look at is going to be the Providence and UConn game here. And now this game, UConn is favored to win by about 7 or 8 points. And I think UConn has a lot of guys that are overpriced. Andre Jackson would be the best player on the team to consider, but I don't really love the game, and I think that it's kind of wonky. Providence, Hopkins and Carter are both playing well, but they have some risk here with them being one of the lower scoring teams on the slate, and so, I think I would stay away from this game for the most part. As for the next game, the Vanderbilt LSU game, this game looks interesting. The scoring output is at 141 points, which is among the higher on this slate. Obviously, the Wake Forest game is the highest, and they have a couple games over 145. But this game looks pretty interesting. Both these teams play pretty good and a little bit faster pace this season than normally. I'm shocked that Vanderbilt is favored to win this game. Robbins does look like a really good option today, and is the top dog at center. And he looks like he's probably the best player on the slate on this team for them. And if they're going to win this game, he'll have to play well. LSU is favored to beat Vanderbilt, and that kind of surprised me. But nobody on this team really plays consistently, and it seems like they shake up the roster game to game. So I do think it's kind of a risky play. For the next game here, we're going to look at the Virginia and Boston College game. Now, this game is the lowest scoring game on the slate at under 125 points, and Boston College is favored to lose this game by 9. As for Virginia, everybody seems overpriced on this team. I didn't really see anybody that looked really good here. Not only that, but this game is lackluster in the scoring potential. Boston College, on the other hand, they have one value play that looks kind of interesting, but it's still risky due to the low output of this game. Should be a defensive game, and they're not favored to win. They are the absolute lowest scoring team on the slate at just 58 points, and so I don't like them at all. I think that game is one to avoid for the most part, exception of maybe McClartin from Boston College. So then we're going to look at Syracuse and Clemson here. Clemson has some good options on the slate, and they're favored to win this game by about 4 points. And this is a higher scoring game at 143 points. Clemson has some good options. As for Syracuse, Jesse Edwards is interesting, but very risky here. No one else really looks worth looking into other than him. But I don't really like this game from Syracuse's perspective simply because they haven't played well against Clemson in the past, and I look for Clemson to probably win this game going away. Then we have Kentucky and Florida. Now this game has a 2-point spread, but I think this game is actually going to be more in favor of Kentucky. Now it is an away game for them, and they have been inconsistent this season, but Florida is missing Castleton, which gives Oscar Tshiebwe pretty much unlimited access to the rim, both offensively and defensively, and I look for him to have a big game and rebounds and points, so he's definitely a great option. But everybody else in Kentucky has been inconsistent. Even with the injuries, Calipari has really been mixing and matching the lineups, and the guys are not really playing a consistent amount of. Sorry about that. My microphone crashed. With Castleton out and guys playing inconsistent minutes, the only guy that's really worth using in this game at all is Oscar Tshiebwe. And if we look at Florida, there's really nothing to like here. The bench is deep. They're going to play a lot of guys. Nobody's played consistently, and they don't have their best players. So I think they're a team to avoid almost all the way around. Then we're going to look at Butler and DePaul. Now Butler is not favored to win this game. They're expected to lose by 2 points. And Butler does have some guards that look decent, but they are risky due to the lower points total, which is at 138, and the fact that they're favored to lose. As for DePaul, they all look way overpriced outside of Ogande, so I think he's the only guy that's really viable for them. But it does look like an interesting game to watch. But it's going to be one of the tighter games on the slate. But it doesn't look like a great game to pull players from. Then we're going to look at Houston and Tulane. Now this game is interesting. I really like a lot of the players on Houston, including Sasser, Roberts, and Sheed, but they all looked a little bit overpriced considering the fact this is the one of the higher scoring spreads on the slate, with it being a 15-point spread, and it not being one of the higher totals on the slate. They do seem risky with their prices, so it makes them a little bit harder to roster. So I didn't really include them. But Sasser, if I had to pick one of them, Sasser would definitely be the most likely to have a big game. But I still find it to be risky. I think all three of them have a chance to underscore a little bit due to the fact that they probably won't play max minutes. As for Tulane, it looks like they may get blown out. Forbes and Cook at least could be okay, but I don't think this roster really has a lot to offer here, especially considering they're one of the lowest scoring teams on the slate. But Cook's worst game as of late was a game against Houston, so it's definitely going to be a tougher matchup as well. So they are pretty risky to utilize anybody from that team, or anybody from that game for that matter. Then we're going to look at Iowa. Oops, let me click over here. Sorry about that. This Iowa game here between Wisconsin and Iowa. This game is relatively low scoring as well. Obviously, it's a Big Ten matchup, so what do you expect? This doesn't really make me like anybody on Iowa all that much, even though it's a tight game, 1 point game. Murray and Perkins look relatively safe, but they don't have big time potential in this game. So I don't think they're great plays, but I think they're decent plays. And then as for Wisconsin, everybody feels overpriced, and it being a slower game on the slate, it seems like a team to just want to avoid in general. Then we're going to look at Wake Forest and North Carolina State. Now, Wake Forest is favored to lose this game by 5 points, but it is a higher scoring game on the slate. It's the highest scoring game on the slate at over 155 points, which is almost 8 points over the second best one. And everyone for Wake Forest is overpriced, but Appleby is a little bit overpriced. But I do think he can be useful as long as they can keep the game pretty close, which I think they will. And so I think he's a great option on the slate. Joyner and Marcel are also really good options for North Carolina State. Everyone else seems a little bit overpriced for North Carolina State, but they all are. This is going to be a high scoring game. So I do think they're in a great spot, and guys that you definitely want to take a look at from a roster perspective. And then North Carolina at Notre Dame. This game does look pretty interesting today. Everybody for North Carolina, even though they're favored to win by 6, looks really overpriced here than some of the other teams. When it comes to are you going to choose Baycott or Sheboy? Like Baycott's $1,000 more expensive. It's really hard to want to utilize them. And you go down the list of players for North Carolina, they also have a little bit deeper of a bench, and so that's going to give them some risk. They are one of the higher scoring games on the slate at 148 points, but they do seem kind of risky. Notre Dame also looks kind of risky. They do have one value play in Starling to consider, but that's pretty much it. This game, despite being high scoring, both teams just kind of go deeper in their bench than some of the other games, and so they are a little bit more risky. Then we're going to look at Alabama and Mississippi. Sorry, not Alabama, Mississippi. Alabama and South Carolina. Now, this game is interesting because it is the second highest scoring game on the slate at 149 points, and both these teams are actually favored to score a decent amount of points. South Carolina is favored to score almost 70 points, which is surprising, but Alabama has plenty of good players to choose from. Everybody seems relatively fairly priced, other than Brandon Miller, who I don't think is rosterable. But he does have upside, but he is not somebody I really like today, especially given the situation to Alabama. I don't expect him to play particularly well in this game, or maybe even a ton of minutes as a way for the coach to kind of give him some sort of discipline. I'm not sure. So I just feel like he's somebody to avoid because it's kind of risky. As for South Carolina, everybody seems underpriced on South Carolina. One of the only teams I felt that way about. This is a blowout game, though, so that's risky. But a lot of their guys are going to play the minutes anyway, just even if there is a blowout, and they played well against tough teams. When it comes to, even when they get blown out, they still seem to put up some decent fantasy points, with a couple of exceptions. And so I do think they're worth considering, but they're still risky, and so they're all contrarian plays, but their prices make them playable. And then finally, last but not least, Auburn and Mississippi. Now, this game is interesting. It is one of the lower scoring games on the slate, but there are some decent players to consider at Auburn. I think they're kind of priced fairly, but a little bit overpriced, whereas Mississippi, even though they're favored to lose this game, have a couple guys in Brakefield and Morrell who look kind of interesting today. Not like over the top great, but still have some decent look to them. But overall, this slate, I do think it's better than yesterday's slate. I do think that there's some really good games here and some fun games to watch. I definitely hope that Oscar Tshiebwe can have a big double-double against Florida so they can win. As a Kentucky fan, obviously myself. But with that said, I think there's a lot of good options. I think you can make a lot of good lineups today. It's probably going to be a pretty high-scoring slate as a result of the value and stuff that's available. So if you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them below. Thank you guys for liking, commenting, subscribing, and have a nice day, guys.